Welcome back, everyone, to From the Stands College Football Show. It is championship weekend. The title game is upon us. It's the last game of the season. And for this last game, we have again Andy Hopper and Tom Scavetta. Andy, how's it going?
It is going. Ready to talk some football once again, hoping the championship game will be better than the shitty semifinal games, if I'm being honest, which I do think it will be, because it is the two best teams in football, in college football, excuse me, going up against each other. Don't you worry, Brian. We are no longer Scavetta-less. We've got Tom fully in stock, ready to go for this show. But I'm here, excited to be here. Yeah, let's go.
Mr. Scavetta is indeed here with us, loaded up with puns. Again, I am sure. Tom, how's it going?
It's going great, except for the fact that Notre Dame took a hard loss on New Year's Day to Spencer Sanders. That name will probably haunt me in my dreams for the rest of the calendar year. Very disappointing there, but I think what was more disappointing was the performances by Cincinnati and Michigan in the semifinal games. But when you have two powerhouse schools like Georgia and Alabama, I really wouldn't expect anything less. We could take these two teams 2 months ago and probably predict that this would be the national championship game. So shout out to both of these squads for making it. And Brian, as always, it's been a pleasure doing this with you all season long. And I'm really looking forward to previewing the national championship game.
And we will do that. But before, we're going to do some quick semifinal takeaways. Like you said, these teams probably were, far and away the best, like the 1A, 1B teams, and then everyone else a tier below. Andy, doesn't sound like you like the semifinal games. So what are your takeaways here?
They sucked. It wasn't fun. Give me a semifinal game that's not a blowout. Give me something that is interesting for, more than a quarter. I mean, I want to give Cincinnati a little bit of credit because they did keep it as a 2-score game like late into the third quarter, but they still end up losing 27-6. They really didn't get much going on offense. I know Ritter did not look great. Their first drive, they come out and drive right down the field. They run the ball and then they get in the red zone and they're forced to kick. They take 3. They have another, one more long drive. Same thing happens. Forced to kick. They take 3 points, and those are the only points they put on the board. A couple other times they get down deep in the red zone. They just couldn't convert. And, Alabama was just Alabama. They just kind of slowly choked them to death in a very methodically football way. I don't know. That really didn't make any sense, but it was just like almost watching paint dry at certain points. But it was just – Cincinnati's defense didn't play that bad. I shouldn't say that bad. There were bright spots. There were some very low spots. Obviously, you let Brian Robinson run for 204 yards, breaking school records. They did intercept Bryce Young one time, but then again, it gave the offense great field position. And I think Cincinnati ends up punting the ball away, or they turned it over themselves. So it was just a lot of Cincinnati not being able to get out of their own way. It was, like I mentioned, that first drive, I think it was like 60 yards, and the rest of the first half, they had like 17 or 18 total yards or something like that. So it was credit Alabama for, stepping up defensively, because that has been a question. I know I've questioned it. I think we've questioned their defense on this show before, but they really did step up and prove that they were the better team. Not that I thought Cincinnati was a better team, but they were one I was really gunning for to at least give us an interesting game. But they truly proved. I don't know if anybody really wants Bama.
Indeed. Tom, what were your takeaways here from these semifinal games?
Well, I'll tell you this, Cincinnati, they didn't look good at all. Desmond Ritter didn't have his best game. Alabama defensively had 6 sacks, 2 of them coming from Will Anderson Jr., who's been a force. And defensively, we got to give Bama credit. Their corners, like Jordan Battle, what they were able to do, holding their go-to receiver, Alec Pierce, to just 2 catches for 17 yards. And I'm sorry, I don't care what college football team you are. If you get outrushed by 300 yards to 75, guess what? You're not winning. Brian Robinson Jr. explodes for 204 rushing yards, and then Trey Sanders, a name that probably none of the country has heard of before this past week or so, rushed for 67. So that tells you all you need to know. Bama exploited a good Bearcats defense. Andy,
Yeah.
I know you have a
I
point you
got
want to follow up on.
the Trey Sanders thing. I know none of us know him, but like knowing Alabama, he's probably a fucking stud. And next year he'll run for like 1,200 yards, and we'll all know who Trey Sanders is.
Oh,
The
absolutely.
the Alabama way.
And what about Ja'Cory Brooks coming out of nowhere, right? I mean, no John Mechie the third. They didn't need him. They didn't need him. Bryce Young, I mean, not his best game, but he still threw 3 touchdowns and, Cotton Bowl. Are we previewing Georgia now as well, or are we?
Yeah, both semifinals.
So, I guess I'll just give my quick take on that as well. Stetson Bennett, 3 touchdowns. I don't know why there was a lot. I mean, once Michigan is eliminated for good, that is my best moment as a Notre Dame fan. Knowing that Michigan has zero chance to win it all is just like an oh yes type of moment. Cade McNamara looked like absolute trash that you would take out on a Friday night after you eat your large dinner. 2 interceptions on this game. Hassan Haskins was a non-factor. 9 rushes for 39 yards. Blake Corum just 13 rushing yards and 1 lost fumble. We mentioned, guys, if Michigan was going to win this football game, what did they need to do? They needed to run the ball well, and Aiden Hutchinson had to take over. Well, Georgia's defensive line, Devontae Wyatt, Jordan Davis, they did not have a shot in the trenches at all. Nakobe Dean was all over that. Aiden Hutchinson was taken out of this game. 0 sacks for him, and a big difference maker in this one. Michigan had 3 turnovers. Georgia had none. And also want to give a quick shout out to James Cook, the running back, was their leading receiver with 4 catches for 112 yards and a touchdown. And my guy, Brock Bowers, with the touchdown himself, his 12th on the season. So shout out to the tight ends. Always got to show some love towards them. And Georgia advances and eliminates the awful Michigan Wolverines.
So I think it's just interesting because like all we talked about all year, if you were talking Michigan, was just how dominant their offensive line had been, and their rush attack was one of the best in the country leading up to that game. And then you enter Georgia's defense, which probably has 11 guys that could all be drafted at some point. And it was honestly like watching a bunch of NFL dudes against that college team. It was insane. They couldn't get anything done. I'd argue Michigan looked way worse than Cincinnati.
Yeah.
I also don't understand the McCarthy and the McNamara thing. I think McCarthy's already a better quarterback than McNamara, or at least he looked better in this game. He was their leading passer. 7 for 17 isn't great. 131 yards and a touchdown. He actually was able to make a few plays with his legs, and their offense did look a little better. Not really great, but it did look like it was moving a little bit better with McCarthy out there under center. But yeah, I mean, I think the story here is Stetson Bennett. At least for me, I think he had the game of his life, probably the best game of his career, with 313 yards, 3 touchdowns. He was just untouchable, and I think he's going to have to do that again against Alabama for this Georgia team to win. But I mean, the defense is fully back for Georgia. I think I said it earlier. It's like we forgot after they kind of got punched in the mouth by Alabama in the SEC championship game how good this Georgia team really was, because really they were the only team I had any faith in all like 12 weeks of the regular season. I know the pretty much all a lot of college football fans were talking about was how good Georgia was. Of course, Bama pulls a Bama, wins the SEC championship game, and we forget. And I think Georgia kind of played with a little bit of a chip on their shoulder, and I think they're going to have to do that again in the national championship game. But it really is. It's the Georgia defense against this Alabama offense. Tom, you mentioned not needing Mechie in the last game. I think they're going to miss him a lot more against this Georgia secondary. And what do you do with Jameson Williams, a guy that absolutely torched you in the SEC championship game with like 180 yards and 2 touchdowns? So we'll see. I really liked what I saw from Georgia. I thought they looked the most dominant out of the 2 winners here, and I thought Michigan really comes out of it feeling the worst.
Yeah, just well covered by both of you guys. But just the two things that I'll mimic here that stand out is both of these teams were suffocating and both of them were dominating in their games. At no point in either game did I think the opposing team had a chance, basically. It was, I mean, like you said, B-Rob, it looked so easy for him to go through that Cincinnati offense. I think Nick Saban himself was almost surprised at how easy it was. Like, they took him off the field. He could have stayed out there. I mean, granted, I'm sure he got tired, but you could have left him out there all game, and he probably would have still averaged 7-8 yards carry for the entirety of the game. But like you said, they put in Trey Sanders to get 14 of his 70 total carries on the season to give Robinson a little bit of a break there. And then as far as the Georgia Michigan game goes, Stetson Bennett, like you guys said, he was extremely accurate. That's one of the big worries they have for him. He did perfectly fine. Georgia got up big early because of that. And like you said, Tom, Michigan's running game was almost non-existent. And a part of that was because they went down so early, kind of forced them to throw. Then you have McCarthy and McNamara, throwing, I think, 18 for 36 combined. You're not going to win a college football semifinal game throwing 50%. Just quick takeaways from me. You guys pretty much covered everything. So there's our takeaways. We'll move in now to the title game here and what you guys think. I guess is gonna happen here. We've got a rematch on our hands. Georgia versus Alabama in the title game. Is Alabama going to pull it off again? Or does Georgia, get a little bit of redemption here? Andy?
I don't know.
It's so tough, right?
It's okay. So it scares me because Georgia is the 3-point favorites. I never want to bet against Nick Saban as an underdog because they just use that as just fuel. That's just fuel to the fire for them. The tasty kind of rat poison, I think, as he's called it earlier. So it just really comes down to the Georgia defense versus the Alabama offense, because what is really the only way Georgia's been beat so far this year? It's been by Alabama, and it's been they beat them deep. Jamison Williams just had an absolute day against them. Like I mentioned earlier, 7 catches for 184 yards and 2 touchdowns. So if they can, bring an extra corner on him, jam him at the line, because you don't have to worry about John Mechie. I think you try to make one of these younger guys hurt you, or you don't let Jamison Williams beat you again. This is a Georgia defense that they're still only allowing 9.5 points per game. Alabama's the only team that was able to get to them. I think that, like I mentioned earlier, I think they come into this game with a little bit of a chip on their shoulder. And, I really want to pick them to win, but I just have no idea. I'm for Georgia. Tom, please save me.
All right. Well, these two teams both met back in the SEC championship game. This is the first thing we have to talk about, right? Okay. Bama won that meeting 41-24. Bryce Young went off on this Georgia defense, 420 passing yards and 3 touchdowns. But here's one thing to note. Brian Robinson Jr. only had 55 yards on the ground. The big hog in that game was Jamison Williams and what he was able to do, getting over 180 receiving yards and scoring 2 touchdowns. Now, here's a big note for Bama defensively. Jordan Battle and DeMarco Hellams each had an interception in this game. Bama has very underrated cornerbacks that are not talked about. In the beginning of the season, they were still growing and developing into their roles. Now, they're a lot more competent at those positions. Stetson Bennett threw 2 picks to each of those players in this game. Bama won that turnover battle 2-0. How is Georgia going to win this game? They need to force turnovers. Why? Well, James Cook did not have much success on the ground, just 38 yards. The only thing Georgia was able to get going offensively in that game was Brock Bowers over the middle of the field. He had 140 receiving yards on 10 catches. Also, one thing to note, the Bulldogs did not have a single sack in that game. Now, I'm looking at Georgia, right? they average 39 points per game. They're only giving up 9.5, and that number is much less if they don't get blown up by Alabama in that one game, right? That's how perfect that Georgia defense has been this season. Zamir White and James Cook are threats in the backfield, but I think if Georgia's going to win this football game, James Cook needs to get involved in the passing game because Georgia does not have a wide receiver that really strikes fear in this Alabama defense. Georgia needs to establish a running game and attack the middle of the field. James Cook has 4 touchdown receptions, and Brock Bowers has 12. Those are the guys they have to go after. All due respect to Ladd McConkey and Jermaine Burton, who each have 5 touchdowns, I don't think they're going to be much of a factor in this game. I see neither of them eclipsing that 50 receiving yard mark. Defensively, Nakobe Dean has to step up. 6 sacks and 2 picks. Channing Tindall, 4.5 sacks. Trayvon Walker, Robert Beal Jr., the list goes on. This Georgia Bulldogs defense is insane. I didn't even mention Adam Anderson yet. He's another great player to talk about. And then Darion Kendrick leads this team with 4 interceptions. So they just produce a defensive machine. Their defense is a factory. These players come out, they're very successful, and they make the NFL. My biggest key for Georgia, can Devontae Wyatt and Jordan Davis slow down Brian Robinson Jr. again? If they can, they do have a chance because, like you mentioned, Bama does not have John Mechie III. It allows the Georgia defense to focus on Jamison Williams. Now, defensively, you still got to worry about Will Anderson Jr., 17.5 sacks, but it's really just an omen in this game. And I'll save my difference makers for just a moment, but as of right now, I think these two teams are pretty much even, but with all the stats I just rumbled off, Bama has a slim edge in this game, guys, even as the underdogs.
So I got a Georgia Bama stat that is pretty, I don't know,
pretty juicy.
Probably fun. It's pretty hilarious if you're a Bama fan, pretty depressing if you're a Georgia fan. So Georgia and Alabama have played 240 minutes of football in their last 4 meetings. 2017 National Championship game, 2018 SEC Championship game, 2020 in the 2020 regular season, 2021 SEC Championship game. Georgia has either led or been tied for 171 of those 240 minutes, or 71% of the time. They're 0-4 in those games. So for me, it's, can Georgia play a full game? I think the defense is going to come out with their hair on fire and try to punch Alabama in the mouth. That's what I think they're going to do. I think they're pissed off. They're going to know. I mean, I'm sure their coaches have been drilling it in their heads all week. You're going to let these guys hang 41 on you again? Like, there has to be some sense of pride here with this Georgia team that has looked dominant against everybody but Bama. That they come out on the defensive end and really try to stifle him. I just don't know if I see that happening. I want it to be a shootout. Those are the most fun games to watch. But yeah, I mean, for me, it's really hard for me to pick against Alabama, even though I think if anybody's going to beat them, it's going to be Georgia. But we're going to have to see another performance from Stetson Bennett, like similar to the semifinal game. Like, I genuinely believe he might have to go for 300 plus and 3 touchdowns. Right. Do we get Zamir White? Do we get James Cook going? Like you mentioned earlier, Tom, James Cook was the leading receiver in the semifinal game. So I don't know if that's going to be sustainable to beat this Alabama team. Definitely have to keep Will Anderson Jr. out of the backfield because 17.5 sacks is terrifying. But yeah, it's shaping up to be a great college football game. But it's can Georgia sustain? Because I feel like they're going to come out excited and maybe jump out to a lead. But can you hold that lead for 4 quarters, not 3.5, and how long are you going to let Alabama hang around and potentially do what Alabama does and just rip your absolute hearts out at the last second? I will say, I saw a tweet. Georgia fans are reportedly already at the Indy airport barking at baggage claim. They are ready to go for this game. It is Friday, ladies and gentlemen. This game is on Monday, 3 days early. Just soaking up Indianapolis and all that it has to offer. They're barking. They're ready for them dogs, baby. So, I mean, I'm going to be rooting for Georgia. Pains me to say, but I'll go dogs.
Yeah, the dogs are barking. I'm sure. That stat that you brought up is super interesting to me, the 240 minutes thing, because let's not forget they did jump out to a 10-0 lead against Alabama in that SEC championship game before Alabama hung 24 on them before going into the half. Both teams executed almost to perfection in the semifinals. So for Georgia, I think you have to be at perfection. You can't even be close to perfection level for this game. I think you have to execute again to perfection if you want to win this game. The lead thing, like you said, they've lost those last 4 games despite leading in almost all of them. They've lost to Alabama, I think, like 7 times in a row now, the last 7 games. And they have no championship title since 1980. So I'm sure that's, weighing on all the players' mind. That's weighing on Kirby's mind. It's weighing on all the fans' minds, despite the fact that they're out there barking. So it's gonna be rough. I think they need to manage this game as well as possible, or they're going to get wrecked. They cannot go down big early, or this game, I think, is over. Despite Stetson's pretty good game in the semifinal, you cannot go into the second half down big. A stat that I have written down is with Stetson Bennett at Georgia, when the Dogs have gone into the second half tied or losing, he's thrown 57 balls. Of those, he's just 28 for 57 with 313 total yards in those 57 throws, 2 TDs, 5 interceptions. So nerves could be obviously a very, very big thing here going into play. And then the turnover battle, Alabama won it 2-0 in the SEC championship game. And a fun fact here, if you want to beat this Bama team, they lost 1 game all season. It was to Texas A&M. That was the only game that Brian Robinson fumbled a ball all year long. So that turnover battle is going to be something to watch as we move into this title game. And of things to watch, we're going to do our key players to watch. We'll start with you, Andy. Who are your players to watch for Alabama?
So a guy I talked about earlier, it's Jameson Williams. He is going to be their number 1 target. He's been their number 1 target for most of the season. That's why he came to Alabama from Ohio State, because he wanted more touches. He wanted to be that number 1 guy, and it's really worked out. He's 75 receptions for 1,507 yards, 15 total touchdowns, an average of 20 yards per catch. This guy has been putting up prolific numbers, one of the better receiver seasons we've seen in college football in the past couple seasons. But if you look at what he did in the semifinal game, 7 receptions for 62 yards, not a huge factor, but they didn't really need him to, because they were running all over the Bearcats. Are they going to be able to do that against Georgia? I'm not sure. But the last time they played, 7 receptions for 184 yards and 2 touchdowns, averaging 26.3 yards per catch. If I'm Nick Saban, I'm trying to get this guy in as much space as possible. I'm running go routes. I'm running deep post routes for him and just letting this guy go make a play. Like I said, I think Georgia's going to have to try to double him, jam him at the line with a safety over top almost every play, and just see what happens. Make Bryce Young spread the ball around and see what happens. Just if you're Kirby Smart, I don't think you can let Jameson Williams beat you twice. So he is my key player for Alabama just because of the game he had the last time they played against Georgia. So now my defensive player, I mean, this one's pretty obvious. It's Will Anderson Jr. He's 54 solo tackles on the year, 17 and a half sacks. Talked about it earlier. First in the country. He's just an absolute menace, and by far the best player on this defense. I really think he's kept them in certain games and kept this unit together and made them a lot better than they would be without him, for sure. But if you look at what he did in the Cotton Bowl against Cincinnati, 2 sacks, 6 solo tackles. I mean, he was a menace, obviously getting to Desmond Ridder there twice. And then the last time they played Georgia, he had, 1 sack, 6 tackles there as well. So can the Bulldog offensive line hold up and keep him away from Stetson Bennett. I think that's going to be a huge factor. Do we see him drop back into coverage on Bowers at all? But we will see. But those are my two guys. It's Anderson and Jameson Williams.
All right. Tom?
For Alabama, my first of two difference makers is Slade Bolden. I'm going to be bold with that one. Without John Mechie III, somebody needs to step up in that receiving core outside of Jameson Williams, and Slade Bolden has been there for a while. He's a senior. He's a guy who can make catches underneath. In fact, he scored a touchdown against Cincinnati. So he is a player that I'm looking at to really step up in this game. He runs routes very well. He knows the playbook off the back of his head. And I think he's going to have a huge factor to help the young quarterback Bryce Young in this game, especially if Georgia does what they did last time to Brian Robinson Jr. Because if they can't get Brian Robinson Jr. going, they're going to be relying on the pass game a lot more than you would think. My next player to watch for Alabama, well, yes, while I do agree with Andy that Will Anderson Jr. is the best player on that defense, my key player to watch is Jordan Battle. He has a knack for causing turnovers. I think he is a huge factor in this game. I mean, this Georgia offense is scoring 39 points. Last time out, they only scored, 21 or something like that, 24. And defensively, Jordan Battle, he's got, 2-3 interceptions on the season. He's a guy who can break up passes, and the reason why there's not much stats to go off from him, he's Bama's version of Ahmad Gardner. Nobody throws his way. So those are my two players to watch for the Crimson Tide.
All right. Mine for the offense is Brian Robinson. We talked about him earlier. 249 rushes, 1,275 yards, and 14 touchdowns on the season. They put a lot of stock into handing the ball off to this guy. We talked about Trey Sanders earlier. Andy brought up he's not much to use. People probably, like you said, have not even heard his name before that semifinal game. He's got 70 carries all season long. 14 of those came in that semifinal game. So it's a lot being put on Brian Robinson's back here. He did breeze through Cincy's defense. This is going to be a much stouter Georgia defense. That line is a lot bigger. I know one of the things that they kept harping on during the game is that Cincinnati just looked perplexed at how much bigger Alabama was on the field in terms of their line. Georgia's the same exact way, so he's going to have to do it again. I think he is going to get a little bit of benefit by the fact that the Cincy game was a little easy for him, or at least he made it look easy. 26 carries, 204 yards, averaging almost 8 yards per carry. I mean, those are video game numbers. But the question is going to be, can Georgia stop him again? Because in the SEC Championship game, he had 16 carries, and they held him to just 55 yards and 0 touchdowns. For my defense, I do agree with Andy here. Will Anderson is my pick. This kid is SEC Defensive Player of the Year, won the Bronco Nagurski Trophy, 97 tackles, 17.5 sacks, 3 of which were from the last 2 games, the SEC Championship game and the semifinal. I mean, this kid is an absolute animal. He's lean, he's fast. He leads the country in sacks as the linebacker. I guess you could probably slot him into that, edge definition. And he has an NCAA record, 34.5 tackles for loss this season. The man is just an absolute animal. And fun fact, he is the first player to record 4 sacks in a game since Derek Thomas for the Tide in 1988. Just absolute animal of a player here, Will Anderson. We'll move on to Georgia now. Andy, who are your key players for the Dogs?
So I kind of went a little out of the box for the offensive side of the ball for Georgia. It's just somebody that, hasn't been there for them this year, but somebody I believe is primed and is able to have a big game, and that's George Pickens, number 1, the receiver on the outside. He's an Alabama native, actually, so there'd be a little revenge game for him here. But so he only has 4 receptions for 55 yards on the year, but he's been out, I believe it's like a foot or something injury for almost the entire season. He's finally fully working himself back. He played against Michigan. He did only have 1 reception for 9 yards. But I think he's back. I think he's fully back. I think he can do this. He's my guy. If he can make play, if they can get him the ball in space on the outside, he is a playmaker. He's 6'3", he's 200 pounds. He's got great speed. He's going to play in the NFL. I think really the only reason we haven't been talking about George Pickens this year is because he hasn't been on the field. He's been hurt, and it sounds like he has worked his way back to being fully healthy, and a fully healthy George Pickens is somebody you want on your team. The past 2 seasons, 2020, he had 36 receptions for 513 yards and 5 touchdowns. As a freshman in 2019, he had 49 catches for 727 yards and 8 touchdowns. He's a guy that's proven he can do it. He's been proven to be a playmaker on the outside, and I think he's going to need to do it against Alabama. So George Pickens is my offensive player to watch, or whatever we're calling these, for the Georgia Bulldogs. On the defensive side of the ball, it's Nakobe Dean. First of all, because Nakobe is a fucking awesome name. Second of all, because he's a baller. 6 foot, 225 pounds. Honestly, he might be the best Georgia linebacker since Roquan Smith, and I love me some Roquan Smith. This guy might actually end up being better than Roquan when it's all said and done. 34 solo tackles on the year, 6 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, 2 interceptions. He does a little bit of everything. He is really, really good at filling the gap. He moves well in space. He's quick. He's fast for his size. Nakobe Dean, I think he's going to have to wreak some havoc, see if he can get into the backfield. In the Michigan game, he had 7 tackles, a sack, and a forced fumble. I'm going to look for him to do more of the same against Alabama and really help Georgia's defense impose their will on the Crimson Tide. So Nakobe Dean and George Pickens, that's who you should be looking out for on the Georgia side.
All right, Tom, I think people watching or who have watched before know who your offensive player here for Georgia is going to be. Give us your key players to watch for Georgia.
For Georgia, it is the man with 850 receiving yards and 12 touchdowns on the season. It is Brock Bowers, the best tight end in all of college football, all Notre Dame biased aside. This guy is a threat. He's only a true freshman, and he dominates the middle of the field. Will linebackers like Christian Harris and Will Anderson Jr. be able to keep up with him? That's going to be an awesome matchup to watch on Monday night. Look out for Brock Bowers over the middle of the field. Defensively is Jordan Davis. I love Jordan Davis because he is a hog who's going to create some fog in the trenches for Brian Robinson Jr. This guy really knows how to stop running backs. We look at what Robinson's numbers were last time. 55 rushing yards in the game. He didn't do so great. Jordan Davis and Devontae Wyatt are going to have a big role in this game, but I like Jordan Davis because his draft stock is rising by the minute, gentlemen, and I really think this is a guy who has a chance to make a huge impact in this game because a lot of times linemen don't get the credit they deserve on both sides of the ball. One thing you notice, if anybody gets talked about on the defensive line, it's the pass rusher, right? If anybody gets talked about on the offensive line, it's the tackle or it's the center. Never do you hear about guards or defensive tackles often. So Jordan Davis is a guy that I happen to really like that is going to have a big impact on this one.
All right. He is indeed a very large human being. For me, offense, no quarterbacks picked. We talked about this pre-show, a bit of a surprise. I'm going with the one that probably a little bit of a surprise because Bryce Young is, a bit of a good player here. Kind of our Heisman winner. We've just ignored him, but I'm going Stetson Bennett here for our player to watch for Georgia on the offense. Disney is praying for a Georgia win. They want to make a movie out of this. I can guarantee it. Stetson Bennett is the former walk-on, wasn't getting playing time, left, went to go train in JUCO, then came back to Georgia, and has now won and kept the starting job over a top QB prospect in JT Daniels for a team looking to win their first title since 1980. I'm telling you, Disney and the Mouse, they're drooling over the potential to make a movie about this if he can lead them to a title here. Running back James Cook said post-game, and this is all stats aside, this is maybe my favorite stat going into this game. He said he ain't got no social media. He carries a flip phone around with him. That is a football guy if I've ever seen one. I didn't even know they still made flip
Huge
phones.
Football guy.
I don't know where he got that flip phone from. Probably from a garbage dump somewhere, because I don't think they produce them anymore. We talked about his stats earlier, though. He has to be accurate. If he can do that, I think he gives Georgia a chance here. He cannot get nervous. People talk about his arm strength not being enough. In the Michigan game, he threw his 6th 50-plus yard touchdown pass of the season. That's the most for a Georgia QB since 2012 with our boy Aaron Murray. So Stetson Bennett is going to be my offensive player to watch. I think he's going to be very vital to how this game goes, especially early. On defense, we just talked about him. He's big. He's hard to miss. Jordan Davis is my Georgia defensive player to watch for me. But it's a bit because, to me, he's a bit of a coin flip. He's a big man, 6'6", 340. Everyone's, seen pictures of him. He is absolutely massive. But in this game, it's not going to be enough to just be big. His size does limit him, obviously, to get into the backfield. So his core efficiency is going to need to come stopping that Alabama run, stopping Brian Robinson from getting into that second level, because, the sacks aren't going to come. You need him on that line, taking up that space. He had 4 tackles versus Bama in the first game. I think he's probably going to need to do a little bit more if they want to win this game. He looked absolutely gassed by the end of the second quarter. I don't know if you guys have seen those videos. I can't risk another copyright strike from, I think, Stadium or whoever wrote me up last time. So I can't put the clip on here. But the clips that were going around of Jordan Davis almost putting in, I don't know if he just wasn't putting in effort or if he was just really that tired. But in that SEC championship game, by the end of the second quarter, he looked dead. He looked dead, and they need him. They need him to be able to produce for 4 quarters. Or else Brian Robinson, I don't think Brian Robinson has another 55-yard game. I think that's a one-off. So you need Jordan Davis there. You need him lively. So he's going to be the player I'm watching on defense to see how they stack up against that run of Alabama and Mr. Brian Robinson. And with that, we're going to move into our game predictions. We've heard some winners already, but we're going to get some scores in here as well. Andy, start with you. Who's your winner, and what is the score of this game?
Pass. I'm just kidding. I'm going to pick Georgia, 30-24.
Okay. Tom, what is your winner, and what is the score?
We broke down all the X's and O's. We went over our players to watch. With that being said, all signs are pointing towards Alabama winning this game again. I'm going to go Alabama. Final score, 31-27. I just don't think Georgia has enough in them. I think the score will be much closer this time with John Mechie being out. I do think that does play a factor, but Alabama will get the better of Georgia once again.
This is a really interesting matchup. A very nice stat that Fox College Football put up. In rematches between top 5 teams that have faced off twice in the same season in CFP history, all of the 4 previous games, the team that lost the first game went on to win the rematch by at least 21 points. This is a chip on your shoulder type of rematch here, obviously on the biggest stage, but I don't think Georgia is going to make that 5 of 5 here. Man, this game is going to be real close despite, whether it's a shootout or despite the fact that it could be, 2009 LSU Bama situation where both teams are under 14 points. But yeah, there are just so many weapons on this Alabama team. They looked so much better in that SEC championship game. And I think if you were to compare skill player to skill player down the line, I think Alabama edges them in almost every category. So for me, I have to take Alabama. I don't think it'll be as high scoring as the first game. The over-under here is 52. And then for those wondering about the line, Alabama, like Andy said, is the underdog at +2. So I'm taking Alabama, and I think a little bit lower of a score. I think we get 31-17 Alabama.
Wow.
Jeez.
And with that,
I'll remember this.
We
So
will-
the Bulldogs.
hey, to be fair, I swung and missed terribly on the Michigan pick, so Andy could be gloating come Tuesday after this game. But that's going to wrap up our show. It's going to wrap up the title game preview here. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to Andy Hopper and Tom Scavetta for joining me once again on the From the Stands College Football Game Day Show. All the links are down in the description for their shows. Be sure to like and subscribe if you like the show, and enjoy the final game of the season, ladies and gentlemen. Goodbye.